Welcome, everyone. Please do come and take your seat. Appreciate that coming straight after President Obama is a hard act to follow. But today marks a really exciting start of the high-level dialogue on finance, on climate finance, under the CMA, so the first event of this dialogue. Briefly, to introduce myself, I am Amelie Amin. I'm Director of Climate Change at CDC Group, which is the UK's development finance institution and impact investor in Africa and Asia. And I'm delighted now to introduce someone who actually really, I'm sure, does not need any introduction here, the COP President, Alok Sharma, who will make some opening remarks for you today.
Thank you very much, Amelie, and folks, it's great to see this room filling up nicely, and I think demonstrates why this particular issue is so important for so many parties. But look, it's great to be here this afternoon, and of course we know that finance is an essential pillar of the Paris Agreement, and frankly it underpins all of our efforts on climate. And it's been a priority of mine as COP President, it's been a priority of the COP presidency, including the three issues that we're going to be discussing today. So as you know, we've got a panel on predictability of finance, and of course developing country ministers have been very clear that this is absolutely critical, and we know predictability is vital to supporting developing countries to raise their ambition. We then have another panel on adaptation finance, and again, developing nation ministers have said this is a priority, and it is clear that we must increase finance for adaptation. And then we have a third and final panel, which is looking at the future trends in climate finance. And this is to consider how we can ensure we have a serious discussion on finance, informed ultimately by the scale of the challenge that we all face. Now, in each of these areas, we have seen progress, including here at COP26, but we recognize on each of them there is far more to do, and so we need to get on with that work. Now, the submissions that countries have made under Article 9.5 of the Paris Agreement provides a snapshot in time. What we needed before this COP was a clear plan all the way to 2025 that brought together commitments made outside those timeframes. So ministers will know that I asked State Secretary Jochen Flaschbart and Minister Jonathan Wilkinson to lead on a delivery plan for the vital $100 billion goal. This has been put together, it's underpinned by analysis by the OECD, and I believe that this plan provides transparency. The plan demonstrates with some confidence that the $100 billion will be met by 2023 at the latest. Now, I recognize that this does not deliver on the promise to mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020. However, the underpinning analysis provides confidence that $500 billion will be mobilized between 2021 and 2025. And since the delivery plan was published, countries have come forward with new announcements, adding billions to public climate finance. Now, with regards to adaptation finance, a number of developed countries, including the UK, have joined a new group committed to championing a balance between adaptation and mitigation in public climate finance. And countries have made adaptation finance commitments here at COP, including today on Adaptation Loss and Damage Day. I can tell you that contributions have been made to the Adaptation Fund totaling in excess of $232 million. This, my friends, represents the largest single mobilization in the history of the fund. This is more than double the previous highest mobilization. The Paris Agreement requires us to align all financial flows with a pathway to clean, resilient development. And of course, this means more public climate finance flowing to developing countries, not least through a step change in adaptation finance. But it also means that we need to double down on our efforts to mobilize the trillions that are needed. At COP Finance Day, there were significant commitments from multilateral development banks and financial institutions, and we must make sure the public and private sectors are working together so that these efforts deliver for developing countries. Now, despite this progress, there is far more to do to meet developing country needs on predictability, on adaptation finance, and on mobilizing the full range of financial resources. And over the course of this week, we will agree our approach to setting a new goal on the post-2025 finance. I've heard from many of you that this must be set with ambition to help us reach the scale of finance needed to meet our Paris goals. And this forum today is an important space to explore the need in developing countries and how we make progress. So I'm looking forward to a rich conversation today. As I said, we'll hold these 3 panel discussions, then open the floor to the plenary, and I'm delighted that the plenary will be chaired by Minister Boland from Sweden and Minister Fuad from Egypt, and they have very kindly agreed to hold ministerial consultations on climate finance matters as part of the negotiations this week. I'm really looking forward to working with them. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started with the first panel, and Amelie, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So without further ado, I'm delighted to first of all invite the moderator of this panel, a good friend of mine, Barbara Buchner, who is Global Managing Director of the Climate Policy Initiative, and then His Excellency, the Minister Ishi Panjof, Minister for Bhutan, and of course, who are also the LDC Group Chair, Her Excellency Yasmin Fuad, Minister of Environment of Egypt, and His Excellency Stephen Guilbeault, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Canada.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amelie, and it's wonderful to be here with all of you today, and very welcome to this high-level panel on enhancing predictability of climate finance. My name is Barbara Buchner. I'm the Global Managing Director of Climate Policy Initiative, or CPO for short, and just for those of you who are not familiar with my organization, we very much work with governments, with financial institutions to drive economic growth while addressing climate change, and we bring a deep expertise in finance and policy. And one of the things CPI is known for is actually tracking climate finance. We've been doing that for more than a decade now, and really providing the most comprehensive and robust information on progress made against the climate investment needs, and in this way hoping to really enable ambitious action on policies on investment by the key decision makers. And I think we've heard both from COP President Alok Sharma, but also really over the last week, all the number of important announcements and important action pledges that have been made from across the finance sector, public and private, which is fantastic. But I think a golden thread is certainly to make sure that these announcements, these pledges now translate into action on the ground, how can it be implemented, and at the same time really thinking about how we can do that with transparency, with integrity. And again, predictability of financial support is obviously a key area here, and so I look very much forward to hearing from this distinguished panel today on how can we enhance predictability and create the needed trust, but also really make sure that we provide the support, the needed support to developing economies to really kind of scale up. So I have a wonderful panel here today. I'm very happy to be joined by 3 ministers from across the world here, and I would love to get us just started by really thinking about some of the lessons that we can learn from all the activities that have been ongoing over the last year and months, particularly looking at the first round of biennial 9.5 communications, the workshops, the related ones, but also the 100 billion delivery plan, which was already mentioned, but obviously it's extremely important, an extremely important part of this overarching plan towards enhanced predictability. So with that, I would like to first start with Minister Ishi Panjof from Bhutan, and His Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be joining the panel member here at this such important topic to the 46th LDC members. The availability and predictability of support is very important for the implementation of adaptation and mitigation plans and for increasing ambition. There is still much to improve regarding predictability of climate finance. The delay in the delivery of the 100 billion goal is discouraging, considering this commitment made over a decade ago. It is time we have to be confident of the goal to be delivered by 2023. The reports on future financial provision from developed countries contain useful information, but also present shortcomings that need to be improved. For example, amounts are not ambitious enough. We don't know if resources will be channeled as loans or grants. Climate change is created and imposed on LDCs. Financing cannot be in loan forms. We don't know how much could be available for adaptation actions. For the LDCs, adaptation is a priority. Adaptation is more important than mitigation. Mitigation is the responsibility of the emitters. The main lesson we can take from current reports for enhancing predictability is that concrete and detailed information is required. We have to go beyond the political announcements. The general statement is necessary and useful to provide a signal and inform what to expect at the general level, but this is not enough for supporting effective planning and implementation. In this context, I would like to mention some elements that could help enhancing the predictability of financial support in the context of the 9.5 article reports. The reports mention that LDCs and other vulnerable countries are a priority, but they don't explain what this really means in terms of amount to be provided, activities to be funded, or type of financial instrument. This needs to be addressed. We would like to know how adaptation action will be supported. We suggest to provide a target or specific amount as part of the budget for adaptation. Aim at supporting long-term programs. Our countries must undertake major transformations that will not happen with short-term support. Consider to address our needs as part of our financial planning, as part of your financial planning. We provide this information in our NDCs, adaptation plans, and national reports. Finally, countries and organizations that provide resources should aim at simplifying processes and minimize disbursement time. Funding needs to reach the needy countries in a timely manner. Investments must prioritize environmental champions and committed nations like Bhutan. Thank you. Tashidele.
Thank you very much, His Excellency. I think a number of very good elements on how we can build on the progress, but really what needs to happen more. So I'd love to hear from Her Excellency Minister Fuad on your thoughts in this context.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Indeed, this question on the predictability and how that would be foreseen, I would like to shed light on two important points. The one related to the Article 9.5 and the biennial communication, and the other one is on our regular talk on the 100 billion USD on the delivery plan. Let me first talk about the biennial communication on the 9.5. We do welcome the submissions by all developed countries. It does provide some information, but this information is mainly related on policies, and other information is related to the regional eligibility. The next round, we think that as we start that momentum, we would need more information. For example, as the one recommended on the workshop. Also, we need more information on the indicative scale, the quantified information. We started the process, we have the information, we learned about the policies, the regional eligibility, but let's move one step further into that. What are the instruments and the challenges? A clearer definition on climate finance, and much more how within those communication to identify the progression on the new and additional financial resources, keeping the balance between the adaptation and the mitigation. For the $100 billion delivery plan, we do welcome the plan, which definitely reflects a commitment to deliver, while still noting that for developing countries, there is definitely a concern on the inability to deliver that goal that has been there for a long time ago. So that concern has to be listened to and reflected in a way or another. I think that the plan, as it is right now, it does provide a roadmap, but it's still not clear on, for an example, how the mobilization of the private sector would happen. We have different reports, and the science would say that the mobilized resources from the private sector is still minimum compared to the public finances that's being provided. Either it's, I don't want to quote any, either it's an OECD report or any other report. So that gap has to be filled to have more clarity on how the mobilization of the private sector would be done. Once that's being done, together with what I mentioned before on having more clarity and in-depth on the definition of the climate finance, and we put over them a clearer methodology for tracking, that would really ensure credibility in delivery and trust among all stakeholders. That's how I'm saying that concern of the developing countries could be filled. One other point is that we should also work on enhancing the scale and not to be boxed in just calculating the average number of the 5 years. The expectation is that we all know that the 100 billion was a figure that was provided and see how we're going to reach that. But we know that the need is much more and beyond that. So we would like to see that 100 billion is being exceeded from 2021. We definitely welcome the pledges that had been done in Glasgow and the additional climate finance put forward by the developing country and the main climate finance contributors. We were just in a few hours ago in the contributors to the Adaptation Fund, and we do appreciate and showed the appreciation welcoming that. But we believe that one good point that we need to learn from that process is that we should be working to make this a sustainable trend during the COPs and reflect in it in the process of negotiation. Not every time we come and see that best practice. So we need to build upon that and keep it really a sustainable process. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Her Excellency. It's extremely important points on really how can you make this a continuous progress, really how do you ensure that this is like a trend that will over time really get to the trillions that we will need, are needed, but using the 100 billion obviously as an extremely important starting point to build that process and the trust here. So this is, I think, the perfect segue to Minister Guilbault, who obviously has been very at the center of thinking about this 100 billion delivery plan and thinking about also how it is probably the start of a longer-term trend. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me start by saying it's an honor for me to be here as the new Environment and Climate Change Minister for Canada. And my remarks will actually echo some of my colleagues. La mobilisation du soutien.
Mobilization of international financial support to help developing countries to adapt to climate change is one of our main priorities here in Glasgow. The key to implement the Paris goals and to improve efficiency, predictability, and the clarity of information on financial support is important. Canada can bear witness.
To lead with Germany on developing a climate finance delivery plan on behalf of developed countries to show when and how we'd meet the goal of raising $100 billion in climate finance. Thanks to the excellent work of my friend and colleague, Minister Wilkinson, and Germany's Jochen Flaschbart, and in collaboration with the OECD, the delivery plan shows that developed countries will make significant progress towards the $100 billion goal in 2022, meet it in 2023, and mobilize more than $100 billion per year thereafter through 2025. The delivery plan identifies guiding principles, such as increasing financing for adaptation, improving access to climate finance, and mobilizing private finance. As important as it is to identify a date by which the world can achieve its climate finance goal, il est tout aussi important de
It's just as important to demonstrate how we will achieve this, not just when. To achieve the goal of $100 billion is not just restricted to a number. What we need also is to implement a climate finance which is effective and in line with the needs and priorities of developing countries.
It is clear that providing forward-looking information, in particular several years in advance, is a significant challenge. Many countries have annual budgetary requirements, which can make it difficult to project a given level of climate finance over the long term. There's no perfect formula here. There are assumptions and uncertainties. Much depends on the scale of public finance as well as government's ability to use innovative tools to unlock finance from the private sector. En juin dernier,
Last June, the Prime Minister of Canada confirmed that we would double our commitment to climate finance. These funds will help developing countries to strengthen their national capacity to take measures for the climate, to strengthen their resilience, reduce pollution, which, as we know, is not stopped by borders.
This week, our adaptation funding will make up a minimum of 40% of our climate finance. In Canada, we know that climate change and biodiversity loss are two sides of the same coin. So Canada will allocate over $1 billion of our climate finance to support nature-based climate solutions with biodiversity co-benefits in developing countries. And we look forward to publishing our second biannual communication next year. My commitment, and Canada's commitment, is to provide as much comprehensive information as possible. À Paris, le monde a reconnu la nécessité.
In Paris, the world recognized the need to align worldwide financial funds and to the seriousness of the climate crisis, and we must step up our efforts.
We must recognize that our work is not done, but rest assured that Canada will be here to play its part in this mission. Our kids and grandkids deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Guilbault, and I think very important points. Again, also I think addressing already one of the issues that we heard before, like having some clarity also on adaptation finance and having that part as part of the goals. I think it's something that can create more of the trust and the basically transparency going forward. But also this importance of comprehensive information, I think certainly something that I see as a golden thread, particularly in this COP here. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to now come to the second round and really understand a little bit better, when you are planning or have, do new programming of your basically initiatives, what are some of the steps that the providers of climate finance should actually bring to the table to ensure that there is more predictability of the support? So is there any specific elements that you'd like to see in new programming that would really kind of ensure more of the trust again and your kind of level of being comfortable basically with new programming? So I would love to hear that. And then also, I think, again, we've been hearing a lot about the 100 billion here. So I think it would be great also maybe to start reflecting on all the lessons that you have just shared. How can that help basically flow into the discussions on the new goal, and what are some of the elements that you feel could be really important, would be important to, again, as Minister Foy highlighted, would enable this kind of longer-term sustainable trend. So maybe let me again start with you, Minister Benji, and really get your thoughts on these issues.
For the LDCs, I think the immediate need to support with finance is the nationally determined contributions. The NDCs of the LDCs are very clear in highlighting the needs of the LDCs, and I think it's very clear for everyone that how much of the impacts of the climate change is imposing on the LDCs in loss of their water resources, food resources, the damages that the climate change is causing in the least developed countries. For the least developed countries spread across the world, we have diverse impacts and also common impacts. So it would be very nice for the developed country partners to focus on, firstly, the common challenges that the LDCs are facing, and then, of course, slowly stepping into the country-specific challenges. So, I mean, as said earlier, we have our adaptation plans ready. We have the low-emission, climate-resilient development strategies in most of the countries. We have all in all, we have the NDCs that's been reported, that's been revised and submitted to the UNFCCC Secretariat. So if the development partners could review, assess the reports and then focus on the most needy ones, prioritizing the most needy and the urgent ones, then that would be very helpful for the LDCs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this, what you just said, like really kind of doing a thorough evaluation and assessment of the needs, and then in this way really ensure that there is a prioritization of how you channel the money to those who are most vulnerable, and ensuring that you leave no one behind is, I think, an extremely important point here. So thank you very much for this. Mr. Foy, let me come to you and get your thoughts on really what next, what are some of these elements that we need to see?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's very important within that issue. We've been talking about the 100 billion and the importance of delivering on that. We know that there is a gap, and we know and appreciate definitely the pledges and the contributions that have been done prior and through Glasgow while we are here, and additional that has been provided. But we cannot look at those financial, even if they are written as a number, without looking at the needs of the country. We need to make sure that, first of all, we would like definitely to reach the 100 billion, but if we're not reaching that the available funding has to meet the needs of the countries, and make sure that the voices of the most vulnerable countries and vulnerable communities are there and being met, because that is not always possible. And I don't want to jump from the predictability to the accessibility, but from our own experience in Egypt, and we know that we went through a very lengthy process of achieving climate finance, is that accessibility and the process is not easy for many of the countries. So we don't want to have more complicated process. We would like even to streamline that process for the benefit of the local communities. And why I'm mentioning the local communities, because that would be the second point, which relates to linking that climate finance and the beautiful pledges that had been done prior to Glasgow and during Glasgow to the adaptation and financing the adaptation. Those are really quick wins that can make a difference in our fight against climate change, because part of our fight is not only the political and the science and the numbers. Part of our fight is changing the culture. We can only change the culture when people can see this is happening to them. The quick wins at the level of the local communities in different countries around the world, even if we're having the very minimal financial resources, would be further replicated and upscale, would make a sound, would make more trust among the youth and the future generation. We need to see where are the advantages of that, and not only at the micro part of just the finance, but the finance and the adaptation, changing the culture. The last point that I would like to tackle is a clear methodology on how the private sector could be further mobilized, and how can that be also measured. It's not only the idea of looking at the public finance and having that as a minimal, but how the private sector could be mobilized, how could that be measured, and how can that be further reported in the biennial communications when we go further. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Excellency, I think, again, a number of very important points that really need to be taken into account going forward. I think the point that you already heard about making sure the funding meets the needs, and but I think also like making the funding more granular in the sense of like understanding how there can be a more systemic change by really focusing on local communities and like making sure that this is something that really goes to those across the countries. But I think the other part on streamlining processes and improving methodologies, particularly on how we can account for private funding and mobilize in this way the private sector more. So thank you so much for that. Minister Guibault, let me hand the floor to you and really hear from you also your thoughts on what's next, what needs to be basically incorporated in new programming.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I see three challenges for us, or three issues. The first one, we clearly need to look at historical examples of what's been happening before. For example, the CDM under the Kyoto Protocol, where we saw the vast majority of projects go to only a handful of countries. And certainly Africa and Southeast Asia, Latin America got very, very few projects. So moving forward, we have to find mechanisms and ways to ensure a fair distribution of projects or money. Should it be public or private money? Speaking of the private sector, clearly we've seen in 2018, 2019 that the private sector has not been very engaged in mobilizing funding, and yet here we are in Glasgow, and we've seen and heard a number of representatives from investors, insurance companies, private sector financiers say we want to be part of this. So how do we do that? And how do we do that? And I totally agree with my colleague from Egypt, Minister Fouad. How do we do that in a transparent, predictable manner? Is there some mechanisms that we can find to ensure that there is predictability, that there is transparency, so on the part of developing countries, they will trust that the process works and that they know what is happening. And what we're being told by some investors is that, well, we need help. We need help finding better projects. We need help de-risking some of these projects, either from where the project is happening or from a technological point of view. Everyone knows how to finance and operate solar and wind parks, but that's not enough. We need new technologies, therefore more risky from a financial point of view. So maybe government have a role to play to ensure that we can make those investments more secure. I mean, the private sector should still be taking risk. That's what they're about. But maybe we can help them to deploy that capital. And perhaps one last thing. I mean, we need to find collectively ways to do that on a scale we've never done before. In the past, we've mostly looked at this from the point of view of project-based funding, but what we need to do is transform entire sectors of societies, transportation, building, agriculture, energy, and I don't see how we get there doing this project by project. We need to find ways to scale it up and scale it up rapidly in ways that meets the goal and needs of developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think I think your last point is extremely important. Again, we need the trillions, and we can only get there if we come up with more programmatic approaches, if we come up with approaches that aggregate, that really allow the scale of investments to flow into these areas. So I think it's extremely important to think about how can we replicate quicker what works, but how can we come up with new maybe financial mechanisms that really can help us get to scale. And I think in that context, really this working with the private sector, there is using public resources most effectively to really unlock private investment for the harder sectors, adaptation, the harder geographies, I think will be extremely important. And learning from the past, I think I couldn't agree more. I think there is a lot of lessons that we have from many years of investments, might not have been called climate investments always, but I think there is a lot we can learn and we can build on really making this happen. And I think some really good points for predictability. So I'd like to have this final round, not just like really getting your thoughts on how we've heard, the lessons and the ideas, the challenges, the solutions that you have shared with all of us today. How can that really basically be incorporated as we're thinking about the new goal deliberations? So what is it there that you think could be helpful going forward? What are some of the key points you'd like to take from today's conversation into this new goal deliberations? And so let me again start with you, Mr. Benjor. The floor is yours.
Thank you. For the LDCs, I think I have made in my earlier remarks that for the LDCs, what we would like to see is that there is resources made available for implementation of the NDCs, nationally determined contributions in the LDC countries, and. Just saying that that the resources will be mobilized, I think that is not really putting confidence in the LDCs. Now it's been over a decade that the 100 billion commitment has been made. That is, and in reality, it is much far away from reaching to that 100 billion US dollar, 100 billion financing for the climate activities. So if things are put in place and then place trust in the LDCs, we are ready to implement. And for the LDCs, as said earlier, for the LDCs, we would like to definitely go promote renewable energies, enhance renewable energies in our countries. We would like to go for energy saving schemes in our housing. We would like to go for e-mobility for our transport sector. And then, of course, the environment conservation, that is always historically priority for the LDCs. We need to continue supporting the environment conservation. The food security, which is a big issue in the LDCs. I think we need to put in systems in place to secure food resources for our people. So we need to have both the production technologies as well as the marketing facility technologies supported in the LDCs. Only then we can, the LDCs will have food security. We would like to go digitalize our systems. So assetizing the systems in the LDCs is very important. The infrastructures, accessibility to our rural communities, accessibility to our farmlands, I can quote so many examples that the developed countries can support for the adaptation for a sustainable development of the LDCs. So if I mean, given the opportunity for the individual LDC countries, we can easily develop project proposals and then submit. Only thing is that we need assurance. We need to see that the resources are there in the basket so that we can access. And then, of course, the procedures to access the finance has to be simplified. It has to be, there has to be a time frame and a system that we can easily access the resources. If these are put in place, then I think we can talk of climate change. We can talk tackling climate change, and we can, see a future in the climate change negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this final point, certainly more granularity, I think is something that has already come out here from this panel, but also this importance of a process, simplified process to access finance, certainly extremely important. But Minister, for your last.
Thank you very much. If taking over back home, one thing out of that panel is the flexibility and the understanding of the issue and the urgency of the developing countries. It's very important that that discussion would continue. And as I mentioned, it's really a good thing to capture on the pledges. But I think that if we start together moving at the next level of predictability, which is how that finance is shaped, measured, private sector included, we would be moving into a completely different big step, a big leap towards building the trust and at the same time giving those finance to the adaptation at the level of the vulnerable countries. So we will be hitting more than one aspect at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister.
Thank you. Three things I'd like to say. So right now what we're seeing from the private sector is largely voluntary-based commitments that they're doing, and they're not parties to the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement. But what we can do to ensure that there is more private sector investment is in our own countries, like mine and perhaps yours and many others, and ensure that our central banks do demand more from these companies when it comes to risk associated with their investment in climate change, stress tests, and many of these things. And I was very pleased to see that the Canadian Central Bank announced numerous steps that they were going to take to ensure that this is done. Secondly, capacity building. If we want for more equitable flow of money through different countries, developing countries in the world, we must the private sector won't finance capacity building. We have to finance that, obviously with the help of multilateral institutions, which brings me to my third point. We need to ensure, especially since many developed countries will flow their funding through these multilateral institutions like the World Bank, as opposed to a few countries will do it on a bilateral level, but by and large the money flows through these institutions. So we must make sure that our priority in terms of climate finance is aligned or with their priority, or perhaps the other way around, that their priority are aligned with our priorities in terms of what we're trying to accomplish here.
Thank you so much for that. I think, again, very important points on both the building the capacity, but also really making sure that all the finance system basically is moving towards a different future, and really making sure that there's more accountability also in the private sector, very much like your point on embedding climate risk into every investment decision and doing that across public and private. So I want to thank my panelists very much for a very rich discussion. Again, I think we've all heard here that predictability is key to operationalizing the Paris Agreement. I think there's welcoming the progress, but at the same time, we need to build on the progress and really do more in order to really provide more clarity. And I think we need more ambition, more granularity on the scale, on the instruments, on the allocation, where does it end up? Adaptation, obviously very important. Mobilizing the private sector, more granularity there. I think we need to better understand the needs, and we need to have better methodologies and simpler processes, and all that learning from the past experiences. Time to shift gears now, but it's a moment of truth. I think with clarity and transparency comes trust. So very much look forward to working with all of you and supporting the important efforts that happen here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and distinguished panelists. So moving from enhancing predictability of climate finance, and great to hear about all the recent developments towards that, we now get to the topic which I think we all realize, and particularly as we heard from the Minister from Bhutan, is becoming increasingly urgent, the need to improve the scale and effectiveness of adaptation finance. So I'm delighted to invite to the panel, first the chair of this panel, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who is COP26 champion for adaptation and resilience, and also the UK Secretary of State for International Trade. And also His Excellency Ayaz Saeed Al-Khayyam, the Minister of Finance for Fiji. Welcome. Dr. Agnes Kalibata, the UN Secretary-General's Special Envoy for the Food Systems Summit and President of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Samantha Power, Administrator of the US Agency for International Development. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Akinwuma Adesina, who is President of the African Development Group.
Thank you, Barbara, for chairing an excellent panel on enhancing the predictability of finance. And I'd like to welcome you all to the second panel as part of today's high-level ministerial dialogue, which is titled Improving the Scale and Effectiveness of Adaptation Finance. Today, we've heard many examples of the importance of action on adaptation and that finance is the key to making this happen. The OECD has determined that in 2019, adaptation made up nearly 25% of total finance as part of contributions to the $100 billion goal. And the UNEP Adaptation Gap report published last week starkly states that despite increases in adaptation finance available, the adaptation gap is not closing. Our own COP26 presidency policy on adaptation, the Glasgow Imperative, calls for fundamental transformation of the ways in which we support the most vulnerable. Critical to this is taking action to improve the scale of finance, improve its effectiveness, improve how we channel it to the places where it is needed most. And I'm encouraged to see that the Champions Group on Adaptation Finance is responding to the call for increased adaptation finance. Launched in the margins of the UN General Assembly earlier in the year, Ireland, Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands and the UK have committed to a balance in adaptation finance. And since launching, Germany and Finland have joined, and we urge other climate providers to commit to balance and also join this group. So I'm delighted to have such a distinguished and diverse group of panelists here today to help us identify both the issues and the solutions. So my request to our distinguished panelists and those in the room is to challenge all of us. What is said here really does matter today. So panelists, let's consider initially the question, how can we ensure that more adaptation finance is mobilized and that it's more readily accessible to those who need it most? And perhaps, if I may, Minister Saeed Al-Khayyam, I will turn to you first. Your reflections on this question.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good to meet you in person, actually. The first and most important way to mobilize finance for adaptation is to stop funding the sources of climate risks and start funding solutions. Mission critical at this COP is cutting carbon emissions to zero. The IMF reports that $11 million a minute are invested in subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. So the reality is that there is a relentless torrent of finance flowing in exactly the wrong direction. This is what we call market distortion, an arrangement that is consciously putting the brakes on transition. It is perpetuating industries that are not sustainable and therefore have no future, while at the same time putting our future at risk. Secondly, we need to deploy finance now because we know it will save costs down the track as the impacts of climate change mount. Investing now is an investment in the stability that all parties, both developed and developing, markets, corporations, and financial institutions need to function effectively. We know the money is there. Right now, developed nations are spending trillions on defense partnerships and weapons of war, including new fleets of submarines, and subsidizing fossil fuels. We're only seeking billions, and everything we're asking is actually supported by science. Fiji has proposed a floor of no less than $750 billion per annum on aggregate beyond 2025 in order to unlock lasting solutions, while half of that finance dedicated to adaptation. And we need clarity in what the word mobilize means. It should not be in the form of punishing high-interest loans and/or expensive consultant fees. It should be in the form of concessional arrangements, grants, responsible market mechanisms, and blended finance solutions. And there should be urgency in ensuring resources are positioned to cut through bureaucratic bloat to reach the communities that need them most, as we've heard previously. Vulnerable countries continue to hear big, bold, unprecedented financing commitments from parties, financial institutions, and indeed companies, and I've heard them here in Glasgow over the past few days. We actually welcome this shift in intent and promise for action. But the question remains, how will these commitments accelerate our capacity to adapt, and at what cost? To those holding all the cards, we have one message. Climate financing effectiveness has clear performance indicators. 1, have solutions reach the most vulnerable. 2, are resources available to help countries access the technology and expertise needed to meet their development needs. We implore both developed countries and the world's corporate powers to use the opportunity of COP26 to improve the clarity of their commitments and recognize our inability to build resilience in a piecemeal fashion. We need to move from a project-based to a programmatic approach. Singular projects do not influence resilience, and unactioned studies and reports do not affect change. You can't build a house, one wall a decade, and expect it to serve as shelter. We need that shelter now. We are urging all leaders to make the investment and build now. This means mobilizing finance at an unprecedented scale now, and making sure that finance is affordable, easily accessible, and fast deploying. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. Dr. Kelly Barter, may I invite you to share your thoughts?
Thank you, and good to be here with you all. Just because we are here and I'm here talking to you all, my first reaction would be, why don't we increase ODA? Why don't we increase climate funding? Yes, that's the question on the table today. But let me be very clear. Only 2% of the current adaptation financing reaches the most vulnerable in Africa. So the question of improving ODA and climate financing will not go away when this problem is still on the table. But I have another reason that I'm interested in why we should increase ODA and climate financing. We need to unlock private sector. This has been said time and time again. We just concluded the Food System Summit, and we showed through our finance lever that we are spending $12 trillion in hidden cost of food, in health and environmental cost. We can actually turn this around into a $5 trillion industry. And this is how we get to do it. We repurpose $700 million that are now being used for poor environmental impact and turn it around to ensure that we're enhancing adaptation finance. That money is already available, and there's no farmer in the world that is actually not suffering. This would benefit lots of farmers and the whole farming landscape. We also can use the money to de-risk private sector in good ways. Private sector can invest in nutrition for people, nutritious food, better fortification. And when they do that, it will be a $6 trillion industry saved from the money we spend on health costs every year. But more importantly, we can start paying for ecosystem services. We can facilitate and de-risk private sector to pay for ecosystem services. There's no reason why reforestation for farmers that are struggling to have food every day should be something that they have to deal with by themselves. There's an opportunity here to pay for carbon financing. There's an opportunity here to pay for reforestation in ways that make these farmers also benefit from adaptation financing. So for me, the imperative is very clear. Let's put the money on the table so that we can unlock so much resources that can be put to good use and save so much money that is going to very bad use. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Delegate Batawata. Samantha, may I turn to you, your perspective on this question?
Sure, thank you. Just to build on Agnes's point about the extent of resources that are going to be needed in this space, the estimates now are around 70 billion, as we heard. By 2030, 140 to 300 billion. By 2050, the estimates are 280 to 500 billion. So if we're where we are as a percentage now that is going to adaptation finance or that is reaching the most vulnerable, imagine if we were to stay anywhere near steady state, what tiny, tiny sliver of the most vulnerable would be reached. So I think you saw in President Biden's own presence here, his commitments in launching the PREPARE initiative to build out our explicitly designated and dedicated adaptation finance. The hope is to get to $3 billion a year by 2024 and as quickly as possible. Of course, that's for the United States a six-fold increase in adaptation financing for developing countries. I want to stress, though, that, and maybe this is the sort of key theme that I'd emphasize here, at least in this opening, which is the importance of integrating the adaptation finance agenda across all governments in all sectors. And I think to some extent, we are doing this, or at least the emphasis in quote-unquote new money is very, very important, as the Fijian minister has made clear. But it's also incredibly important that we're integrating a concern for adaptation finance growth in everything else that we do. And so here, just to offer a few examples from the US perspective, and this is what President Biden, again, has instructed each agency to do, when our Department of Treasury is active in a multilateral development bank, for it to be screening investments for the resilience potential, for using that as a factor in deciding what to finance, what not to finance, or at least to dictate the US position in that regard. For NOAA, our incredible agency that is so good at gathering climate information, so advanced, has these technical tools, this information, climate information and services to be brought to bear to make sure that NOAA, everything it shares is transmitted speedily, that technical capacity is built in the countries where USAID is privileged to work. We have missions in 80 countries. We have programs in 100 countries, integrating what US technical agencies have to bring, whether NOAA or NASA for that matter. That's going to be incredibly important in helping countries predict and developing these early warning systems that developed countries have, even though we struggle with adaptation as well, but nothing like those without that infrastructure. And then even as our Department of Energy now works through its labs with countries to reduce their emissions and on the mitigation file, all of those renewables that are being brought online themselves have to be rendered resilient. I was on a panel earlier today with an Indian minister who was describing solar panels ending up in pools of water rendered useless. We have to embed adaptation and resilience even into our mitigation portfolio, and that's something incumbent on the private sector as well. The last comment I'd make on this idea of integration is just to take note that well in advance of President Biden announcing the PREPARE initiative and this dedicated financing, so much, as Agnes knows, of what USAID does, for example, in the food security space, in the agriculture space, even if it wasn't referred to perhaps by the last administration as climate change programming, it's all about adaptation to the changing climate and to the climate crisis. So as we work together to bring drought-resistant or heat-resistant seeds online and get those inputs out to developing countries and to farmers who are facing conditions that they didn't dream about a decade ago or 2 decades ago, that is, again, making our entire food security agenda something that is filtered through this climate agenda. So too, in humanitarian assistance, USAID is the largest humanitarian donor and has been, of course, for some time. But last year, we spent $160 million in climate-related disaster response. And we know that number is just going to go up. So making sure that we have resources, yes, for adaptation and resilience to prepare, but also as countries, quote unquote, build back, that we use the resources that we have to ensure that they build back better so that the next time a hurricane strikes, the damage is less severe. Thank you.
Samantha, thank you very much indeed. If I may, I turn to President Adesina for your thoughts.
Thank you very much. I wanted to speak from the perspective of Africa. Of course, the main challenge facing Africa is all about climate adaptation. The continent loses $7 to $15 billion a year from climate change, and that's going to rise to roughly $50 billion a year by 2040 if things don't change. But the issue is how much we're actually getting. The continent is getting just only $6 billion a year, and the need is $33 billion a year. So essentially, you have a continent that's contributed no more than 3% to global greenhouse gas emissions that is suffering disproportionately from it. And at the same time, it's been shortchanged by climate change. Now it's being shortchanged by climate finance, and that cannot continue. So absolutely, we have to deal with 3 issues. Scale is important, speed is important, but also predictability of finance is important. Now, in terms of the areas in which I think we can do that, first is just simply meet the $100 billion commitment made to developing countries. Because the NDCs that we had were basically conditional aspirations that were all agreed in Paris. So if the $100 billion a year is not there, we can't be just really asking them to raise their expectations. For on what basis will they be raising their expectations? The second is that a lot of financing has gone to the global climate funds. We need to make sure that a lot of those resources, at least 50% of it, actually goes to climate adaptation, because that's the problem that we have. That's the problem that Fiji has. That's the problem that small island states all have. And of course, for that to happen, we've got to make sure that we also finance the countries to have updated nationally determined contributions, but also have their long-term strategy. Because if we don't have a long-term strategy, it's like you are a car racer, but you can't race on Formula One because there's no track in which you're going to race on. So we absolutely have to make sure that's done. Now, for multilateral development banks, of course, we have to raise our ambition, and we are. For us, as African Development Bank, we've doubled our climate finance to $25 billion by 2025. And in particular about climate adaptation, we are now at 63% of our total financing going into climate adaptation. And so we're doing quite a lot on adaptation. Now, I also want to say that we also need platforms that can deliver at scale. And that's why the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, which we've launched jointly with the Global Center for Adaptation, is so critical to raise $25 billion additional for climate adaptation in Africa. And we've put $12.5 billion down as African Development Bank, and we want to raise here and in months following another $12.5 billion. The private sector, I think Agnes was talking about that particular issue, I agree, but there are 2 parts of it. You need market-based systems, but you also need non-market-based systems. It's not so easy with adaptation because most of what you're doing are essentially within the realm of public goods. So it's very hard to really get private sector into it. So we are piloting now at the African Development Bank something called the Adaptation Benefits Mechanism. In other words, you give compensations to companies that are actually investing in climate adaptation. We are also working with the financial systems in Africa. You got literally $3.2 trillion that are sitting there in terms of institutional investors. Well, if we simply got some of those going into climate finance, we will meet a lot of the needs in Africa. So greening the financial ecosystem in Africa is important. Two last points I'll make. The special drawing rights provide a powerful tool to do this. You know, yes, IMF has these special drawing rights, but I will argue that the special drawing rights also has to be provided to the multilateral development banks that are prescribed holders of SDRs. We at African Development Bank, for example, we can leverage SDR 4 times. So we got $50 billion, you turn that into $200 billion. And so it helps the developed countries to also meet the target of $100 billion, this elusive target that we've been talking about forever. So this is very, very important so that the multilateral development banks complements the IMF as we grow back better in a more climate resilient world. And finally is we need to stretch our balance sheet. We call it room to run. I want to thank the UK government, and thank you very much, and for your support for that, with $2 billion guarantee provided to the African Development Bank, which we are going to use to leverage a lot more resources for climate finance, with most of those actually going into climate adaptation. So I think that with those and other things and just political will, I'm sure that we can get this done. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I give you a positive challenge, panel, to think more broadly. What specific initiatives or approaches have you seen that have been successful in mobilizing adaptation finance? So on the upside, what do we know definitely works from your experiences? Minister, I'll start with you.
A recent one, which is currently, in fact, on foot, is an agro-photovoltaic project, which is a blended finance approach, where the Green Climate Fund has contributed $10 million towards the particular project. It's together with a Korean aid agency, together with private sector, Korean private sector, and our development bank. And you know, as you would know, in the Pacific, we don't have large areas of land to fully dedicate to solar panels. So agro-photovoltaic suits our purpose. It's one of the small islands. So you have the solar panels at top and greenhouse at the bottom. So that's been successful. But I have to add, it takes a long time to get finance from the Green Climate Fund.
Thank you. That's a great example. Agnes.
Thank you. Mine is going to be a very specific example to the work we are doing in Africa, where by working with smallholder farmers, but also businesses that work in that landscape, we are able to encourage financial institutions to let resources flow and to these businesses. And the way we do that is to create a platform of transparency that gives everybody in whatever value chain they are working on an opportunity to see what businesses are at what stage and what they are doing, and the ability to trust those businesses. And then we lay on top of that capacity strengthening for businesses themselves, extension for smallholder farmers, but also then even capacity for banks so that they understand the working of the agricultural sector itself. So provide the opportunity for learning, but also provide transparency in the system so that people who have resources and want to invest have the confidence that actually this money is going to good use and it can lead to business growth. So these are things that are working. I would say for every dollar we are investing, actually, let me just really appreciate the support we get from USAID. In places where we've invested $50 million to reach 10 million farmers, we have been able to catalyze 660 million of private sector resources. So yes, when you make it visible, when you make it possible for private sector to see where they're investing the money and to see how the businesses are growing, everybody's happy to invest. So it's really partnerships at that level.
That definitely deserves a round of applause. What a fantastic story. Thank you. Thank you. Samantha.
Yeah, I would offer a few examples to sort of illustrate larger points that I think others have made. Very much building on Agnes's example, and building on my prior comments about needing to integrate this agenda into all of our programming. In a sense, USAID being now a climate agency, because there's not one aspect of our development programming or development financing that isn't affected by the climate crisis. So in Guatemala, just one example, USAID basically put in $1 partnered with an agribusiness. We put in $1 for every $1 we put in to minimize the risk. The agribusiness put in $3. That's the leveraging that Agnes is speaking about. And in partnering with the agribusiness, the local farmers are given the kind of training that they need, access again to these seeds, because there is such technological innovation and adaptation occurring. But where we chose to do that program is in an area where malnutrition is the highest, where you've already seen the corrosive and devastating, really, effects of the changing climate on agriculture. So the private sector on its own may not have come in, the agribusiness may not have gone to this community, it might have been the last place it looked, but because some of that risk was borne, much of that initial risk was borne by USAID, we were able to train thousands of small farmers and help them also get their goods to market. A second example, which comes also from our hemisphere, comes from a program that we're running in Peru. And this gets to the link between, which we haven't actually talked much about, any of us, but governance and policy reform, and how important regulatory reform and different kind, an ability to do domestic resource mobilization, which is something all of us have been pushing for years in order to ensure that people have more domestic finance to be able to access, because every country wants to be self-sufficient and not have a USAID mission, of course. But one example in Peru is that we worked with the Peruvian ministries to support them in their efforts to collect public water use fees, so basically tariffs on water use. And as they were able to increase revenue from that source by virtue of, again, policy changes, regulatory changes, better enforcement, the additional revenue that they collected, they pumped back into water-related natural infrastructure. So basically, the mobilization of resources occurred, then the money is channeled back into restoring natural infrastructure and building out resilience in water systems. The last example I'll give, I now forget, I think it was our Fijian friend mentioned the challenge of securing funds from the Green Climate Fund. I will say it's also very challenging for local organizations to partner with USAID. It's incredibly complex and onerous, and it's something that I'm very focused on. How do we make it easier for local partners, local organizations, our resources to reach the local levels? So I'm not in a glass house talking at all about GCF and the challenges there, but we do have a program called Adapt Asia Pacific, which is about, again, using our presence in 80 countries to help those countries actually submit proposals to the Green Climate Fund, knowing that direct access programming has been very challenging for the GCF and is very challenging, particularly for Pacific Island states. So if we can offer that support to help them develop their proposals, which are often incredibly complex, that can be a way of unlocking international finance that might not otherwise be obtained.
Samantha, thank you. President Adesina, something a specific approach that you have seen that's really successful.
Thank you very much. I'll just come back to what I was saying about the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. It's a lot of adaptation work in Africa going on over the years. The point is they are very, very disjointed. They are not at scale. They don't deal with systemic issues, and they don't have financing at the scale that's needed. And so, for example, the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, which we launched together with the Global Center for Adaptation, it's actually going to be the biggest game changer that we have on adaptation in Africa. Well, just think of what it does. It gets you climate advisory services to 30 million farmers and pastoralists at a scale we've never really seen before. You're looking at infrastructure, rural infrastructure, urban infrastructure in terms of building resilience of those at about $7 billion. Then youth, we're working with 1 million youth to get them into climate resilient businesses or green businesses. And just about, in fact, last week, Friday, we had something called the Youth Adapt Initiative, which we gave out prizes of $1 million to businesses of young people that are moving from drought-tolerant varieties to those that are doing drip irrigation and all manner of drones and so on to help communities to adapt. And of course, to leverage $3 billion in climate finance per year from the private sector. So you need to have a platform that works at scale. And this is what the AAAP, we call it, African Adaptation Acceleration Program is. The second one I want to share is the Africa Disaster Risk Facility. Now, this Africa Disaster Risk Facility is something that we set up from the African Development Bank together with the Africa Union. And so the issue is countries face a lot of risks, but how do they insure themselves against catastrophic risk events? Well, you've got to be able to pay some premiums for that. So what we do is we actually help them to pay some of those premiums. And it works for Niger, for Mauritania, to Madagascar, and so on. I want to make a plug here that as we think of climate adaptation, we absolutely need to get bigger scale facilities for disaster risk management for countries, including catastrophic events that they have. And the last one I want to mention is, Samantha was mentioning the issue of agriculture about, it's the whole issue of drought-tolerant crops. We have a program called Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation. In just 2 years, this particular program has delivered climate-resilient technologies for over 11 million farmers in Africa. You look today at Sudan, you look today at Ethiopia in terms of heat-tolerant wheat varieties, which we supported them in. In Sudan, that's being cultivated in Sudan and Ethiopia on more than 1.8 million hectares. Now, we gave them 65,000 metric tons of seed of these varieties. And for those of you that are not in the ag, just to make it easy, if you look at an A380 aircraft, the Airbus, it's actually the people, the cargo, the fuel, it's all 98.4 metric tons. So when you see 65,000 metric tons, you're talking about 660 A380 aircrafts. And Sudan was able to increase its food security from 25% to about 56% just in 2 seasons. It just tells you what can be done. We also did this in Southern Africa, where we provided heat-tolerant or drought-tolerant maize varieties to farmers that are being cultivated on 5.2 million households. So these are the kind of platforms that we did. And Agnes was talking about the Food System Summit. We worked together with you, with the AU, on this facility to finance food security in Africa. That facility, we're calling it now, Samantha, 1-200, so which is $1 billion to feed 200 million people. So it's to take these technologies to a scale of 40 million farmers with climate-resilient technologies, and they will produce 100 million metric tons of food. And that is enough to feed 200 million people. And in Africa, where you have 283 million people going to bed hungry every night, that will reduce that by 80%. So that tells you the kind of platforms we have today that we need to make sure we get financing behind to make it work.
Thank you very much indeed. Sadly, we've run out of time for this panel. I could listen to my wonderful guests for much longer. They are full of extraordinary knowledge and expertise. I think if I take away a couple of things, it's that there is a great deal of subsidy funding being spent in the wrong places, which we need to find ways to invest effectively, and that blended finance alongside transparency can drive private sector funding at pace into so many sectors. I think you've given us some very positive examples of what does work, and the challenge of, as you say, President Adesina, making this go to scale is the one that we continue to follow. But thank you all very much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, my panel.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. So we'll move quickly on to our next panel, which I think, as everyone has heard a lot this week about the importance of mobilization and the trillions And we know that those trillion commitments for net zero really have to ensure that they deliver the finance into the projects that actually are consistent with net zero and climate resilience. So this panel is to focus on how to increase climate finance mobilization, and I'm delighted to introduce the chair, His Excellency Dan Jørgensen, Minister for Climate, Energy and Utilities of Denmark, Her Excellency Marcia Cadell, Minister of Economic Affairs and Investment of Barbados, His Excellency Frans Timmermans, Executive Vice President of the European Commission, and Marie Pangestu, Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank.
Thank you so much for that. Excellencies, colleagues from around the world, it is my pleasure to be with you here today at the first high-level ministerial dialogue on climate finance under the Paris Agreement. I highly appreciate the opportunity to discuss how sources of finance can help support developing countries. We all realize that delivering on Paris goals is a make it or break it this year. In that sense, the discussion question in front of us gets it exactly right. To deliver on Paris, we need climate finance to flow from all sources and from all finance to be consistent with low emission, resilient development. How can we ensure this delivers on the needs and priorities of the developing countries is the question. Before I invite our distinguished panelists to kindly share their insights with us on how to best respond to the needs and priorities of developing countries, allow me to share 2 points with you. No one can question the need to urgently scale up the mobilization of climate finance. Notably, finance for adaptation must increase. We must target finance to the poorer countries who need it the most. This is, in my view, unquestionable. That is number one. Secondly, fiscal and economic policymakers and the entire financial system play a critical role in order for us to deliver the right solutions at scale and to have a global impact, from the most vulnerable to the big economies. In this context, I'm proud to announce that the Danish government has just decided to end public financing and export promotion services for fossil fuels. We must all pursue this path, leading finance flows in a green direction. So, with those words, let us get off to a good start, and I would like to pass on the floor to Her Excellency Marie Pangestu, Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships in the World Bank. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Minister. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted to address the issue of scaling up capital mobilization for the need for climate, especially for developing countries. And I wanted to make 3 points, but I wanted to make it in the context of, I think we need to go beyond what I call bean counting on the amounts, whether it's 100 billion or the trillions, billions to trillions, because I think we need to ask the basic questions about what is the money for and how can we scale it up, how can we deliver. And I'd like to make 3 points around this big topic. I think, first of all, I think we have to be clear on what is the funding or the money is being used for. It has to be fit for purpose. A lot has been said about the purpose, and for developing countries, it is really about how you can grow, reduce poverty, have shared prosperity, and address climate. And this needs to mean that you have to integrate climate with development. I think one observation, I have attended many COPs, one observation of this COP is that we've seen many countries stepping up with net zero and more ambitious NDCs. But it will require resources, and it will require a focus on 5 key systems that need to be transformed. These are the 5 systems that contribute 90% of greenhouse gas. It's manufacturing, it's energy, it's transportation, it's urban infrastructure, and it is also the energy transition. And fit for purpose also means country situations and conditions are different. So for middle-income countries, it could be about energy transition. But for the low-income countries and vulnerable countries, as we heard earlier, it is about adaptation and resilience. So the balance has to be there. And we know everybody's been saying about the need for scale and urgency of funding, but I just wanted to add that technology is equally important. And it's not just about transition, it is also about the new opportunities of renewable energy, green industrialization, greening transportation, which means electric vehicles, and so on. The second point I wanted to make was we have this magic number that has emerged of 130 trillion, and it's ready to find a home. But how can we have the portfolio of purposeful and transformative projects for it to go to? Countries need to create the right condition to get these investments, whether in physical, human, or natural capital. And it needs a whole of government, whole of economy, whole of society approach to bring all the stakeholders along. Countries need to demonstrate political will, show that they have a low-carbon, long-term development strategy, because about predictability and certainty of investments, you need that. You need the policies, the institutions, the regulatory, state-owned enterprises reforms, and you need to manage just transitions. So it is politics, as President Obama earlier said in the previous session. Countries are required to show the political will, but they need to understand the trade-offs, the cost of inaction versus the cost of action, the benefits and costs, and therefore prioritize where they should be doing their transformative investments. External parties like the World Bank Group can help and facilitate countries to design these long-term strategies and provide capacity building and project preparation. I would say this is, if you are talking about scaling up the private sector, mobilizing the private sector, for us, this is the first order of de-risking and attracting investment. Then you come to, okay, what else needs to be done? I think you need to see that differentiated investments are needed from the just transition, dealing with stranded assets, to bankable projects, and different sources of funding will need to come together to fund all that, from grants, concessions, and commercial funding. So we need to build, countries need to translate their priorities into a portfolio of what we call transformative and purposeful projects that sits within the whole economy transformation. I think one of the previous speakers said, it's programmatic, it's not projects. It's not green projects, it's greening the whole economy. How do we go then towards this blended finance platform that can be country and or sector-based, which brings all the different sources of funding together, agree on the purpose and framework, speak the same language. This is about the standards and the architecture that we need to agree on, build trust, that's about transparency, and get to scale and impact. I mean, I'm summarizing a very big topic. The public funding, the multilaterals, the bilaterals, even government budget can come in for catalyzing what you want the private sector to come in. They can fund the just transition. They can fund the decommissioning of the coal plants, which the private sector wouldn't come in, and they can do de-risking and reducing cost. And the philanthropies and foundations is another source of funding. And then the key will be how can those funds catalyze and mobilize the larger sources of private funding. And private funding also needs to come to de-risk capital as well as capital for the bankable parts of the investment. So finally, what next? A lot has been said. How should we bring all these different strands together, fit the jigsaw together in a purposeful, practical way that builds on current platforms and connect the dots better? Can we find proof points of how such blended platforms can work? I think the coal transition of South Africa is a good example, and it can be done also in other countries. Nature-based solutions in forestry and food and land use is another good example. Let's work together to unpackage at the country level, coming up with proof points such as clean energy transition and food and land use systems, and bring in the global level partners, public and private, to come together to make it happen with urgency and scale by bringing together the different strands. Let's avoid fragmentation and have the different strands and initiatives that are coming out from Glasgow to scale up financing to come together. Let's agree to define the pathways and partnerships by COP27, and for all of us to come together and work together on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Pangestu. Now, I know that you have other engagements, so I'll ask the follow-up question to you now, so that maybe if you have to leave. So I have two questions for you. One is, when we talk about just transition, we talk about countries managing through a situation where climate change is already there, hitting them. At the same time, of course, as we're looking at a transformation with mitigation efforts, I think, and I hope most people will agree, that we need to look at the balance in the funding between mitigation efforts and adaptation. Both is important, but maybe the balance is not there right now. My own government, we've decided that we will give 60% of our public grants to adaptation efforts in the future. Can you maybe comment on that question? And the second question would be a difficult one, I apologize, but nonetheless, of all the important points that you made, if you had one advice to the negotiators going into this last week on the climate finance issue, what would that be?
Okay, the last one is a difficult one, but let me tackle the first one first. I think on just transition, balance between mitigation and adaptation and resilience. I think, first of all, it's really quite difficult to separate them, right? Yeah. In many instances, you're doing all. But I do think we need to, adaptation and resilience has had less attention compared to mitigation. So I think everybody's now recognizing how that the priority needs to be raised. And the World Bank, in our new climate change action plan, where we are committing to 25 billion a year for the next 5 years, half of that will go to adaptation. And adaptation and resilience tends to be more priority for the low-income countries and vulnerable countries. And here is actually where a lot of that funding will come in as grants, or very, very low, very concessionary loans, because I think the minister from Bhutan, he was asking the question, we need to know whether it's coming in as grants or as loans. So just wanted to emphasize that. So, and I do think we need to understand the importance of adaptation and resilience to the destruction of natural capital. And that hurts, again, the poorest and the most vulnerable. And the ecosystem services that will be declining, and that, again, will hurt the poorest. So putting value on nature is another important piece of the puzzle for the adaptation and resilience. For the negotiations on climate finance, I think we need to continue to, I guess the negotiators will continue to push for getting towards the 100 billion. But I think there is a lot, we heard Alok Sharma earlier mention the progress being made towards the 100 billion. It's good progress, and many, I think one thing that this COP has achieved, at least everybody's ramping up their ambition. Maybe we're not quite there yet, but I think we're getting there. That's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is what I mentioned in my remarks, that let's focus less on the bean counting of, is it 100 billion, is it 13 trillion? Let's focus on how to make it effective and how to make it really work for the countries in question. And that requires the countries really to come up with the, they have to do their homework in a sense, but they have to do it in the political way that can be accepted in their countries, a whole of government, whole of society, whole of economy approach, then they can evaluate the benefits and costs of this low carbon development strategy and prioritize which systems, which investments they want. And that will better define how we can then, whether it's public or private funding, that can come into there. And I think World Bank Group and many others here and partners are ready to work with countries, including small island states, vulnerable countries, to get there.
That is an excellent point. It really is necessary for us to not only look at the figures. They are important, obviously, but it is extremely important that we also focus on how do we actually get the money out there working, making a real progress. So thank you so much for that. Now let me invite Her Excellency Marcia Cattle, Minister of Economic Affairs of Barbados, to take the floor.
Thank you. You know, over a decade ago, I was working as an economist in a country in my region in the Caribbean. When I got there, we passed a bridge that was being built. A billboard was up describing the project, detailing the costs with all of the necessary logos, including the logo of the multilateral bank that was providing the loan to finance the project. My colleague who was with me, who was from that country, said, "This is the second time this bridge is being built. It was destroyed by a storm a little while ago." While I was there, living in that country, another storm passed, stronger winds, more rain, the bridge was damaged again. The billboard with all the logos had slid down the ravine, but months later, there was a new billboard with new logos, with new financing, with new debt to rebuild the same bridge. Some of you will hear this story and think, well, surely there's another place to build this bridge, and surely there's a better way to build it. Well, yes, there was. It is one thing to build in adaptation to stronger hurricanes from Category 3 up to Category 4. Category 5, we know, has no outer limit and doesn't take into account things like storm surge and rainfall flooding. But the question is, what are we adapting to? Global temperatures are already 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and I don't have to quote all the reports that tell us that we are not at all on track to 1.5. But already, countries between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn experience today, and have for years, been experiencing the worsening effects of the climate crisis. Now, as that new billboard was going up, business all over the world continued. Ministers of environment were invited to international meetings in one corner to talk about climate science. Ministers of infrastructure were being told that they had to pull out and show clearly only the adaptation component of their works projects to ensure that climate money was not going to pay for development. As if it is possible for our islands to separate adapting to survive from developing to thrive. Or perhaps as if the world cared only about our survival but not about our prosperity. And on the other hand, in a different corner, ministers of finance were invited to talk about debt, as if to somehow ignore the fact that most of the highly indebted countries in the Caribbean region have accumulated their debt building back after repeated climate-driven disasters. Now, also around this time, as that country was taking new debt to rebuild the same bridge, the IMF was issuing $283 billion in SDRs to boost members' reserves in the recession. Half of those SDRs went unused. So while we fight to reach the $100 billion commitment in climate finance, and while we hesitate on the idea that half of that should finance adaptation in circumstances where the most climate vulnerable countries, one, already have some of the most ambitious NDCs globally. Barbados has committed to a reduction of 70% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So we are using short-term mitigation targets. So in circumstances where the most climate vulnerable countries already have some of the most ambitious NDCs globally, and two, contribute little to greenhouse gas emissions, Morgan Stanley puts the financing gap at $50 trillion over 30 years, and that is on the mitigation side alone. I'm sorry to tell you that we have to do the bean counting. We have to understand the scale that is going to stop countries from having to contend with these ballooning multiple crises of debt and climate and now a pandemic and all the other development issues that we have to face. And we've done the homework. So what does that homework tell us that the future of climate finance should look like? Those unused SDRs from 2009 and the tremendous gap in finance give us a clue, as does the proposal that is already on the table that $50 billion of the recently issued $650 billion in SDRs be put into a trust for climate action. But that $50 billion still does not meet the scale. We meet scale with an SDR issuance of the equivalent of $500 billion annually, and that sounds like a big number. But it is not such a big number if we consider that several countries that have engaged in quantitative easing to the tune of $25 trillion, which means that they have purchased bonds to be able to contribute to or to be able to address economic issues in their own countries. So when we understand that, that $500 billion doesn't seem that great. But when we do that, and when we take a proportion of those annual issuances of SDRs, in the first instance it could be over 3 years, and then we do a review, but that will give any investor in mitigation or adaptation projects the right to borrow at the overnight interest rates of countries whose currencies make up the SDR, which are currently, those interest rates are currently near zero. And to roll over this borrowing for as long as the project continues to deliver some minimum rate of reduction in greenhouse gases or increase in adaptation per dollar invested. So let me tell you a little bit about this homework. In Barbados, our Roofs to Reefs program was established because we were tired, and we've heard it on the previous two panels, we were tired of being complicit in the world's failure to meet the scale of the problem. We were tired of conceptualizing and accepting support for the types of small sectoral projects that do not move the needle in our countries. Roofs to Reefs lays out at least $2.5 billion in key adaptation and mitigation public-private investments for a resilient Barbados. It is a ready market for an SDR instrument that could leverage far more in private investment. So we've done the work, as have other countries in the region. Jamaica has a national adaptation plan. We've done the work to say what projects make sense for private investment and what projects will not make sense for private investment, and where do we have to find and mobilize some of that great grant finance. So in wrapping up, do we need to meet the $100 billion right now with half for adaptation? Yes. And we need to meet it if we don't want the trust gap to grow as wide as the finance gap has become. But we are long past that number. And while we confine loss and damage discussions to ideas of technical support and humanitarian assistance, Barbados remains today the largest issuer of natural disaster clauses in the world, so that in the event of a major hurricane, we do not meet principal or interest payments on our debt for 2 years, freeing up the much-needed fiscal space to recover at scale. We need those clauses in more instruments, globally, multilateral and sovereign debt. This is by no means the extent of possible finance instruments for loss and damage, as it does not address slow onset events. But my friends, we have to get on the road to somewhere. We have to move to a serious finance conversation on loss and damage. The future of climate finance instruments is not murky. We have begun the regulatory changes to have safe institutions that can issue guarantees. In Barbados, we are having discussions on the setting up of a green bank. But we need off-balance sheet investments at scale. And ultimately, we need a revisioned and re-engineered financial system that is bold enough to meet the urgency of this moment. Nothing less will do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, we've already spent more time than we were given, but since I don't see anybody physically trying to drag me off stage, I think it's fair that I ask you at least one question. And that would be, so you present so many compelling arguments for us having to do more. Now, we have 4 or 5 days to do it now. What would, in your opinion, be a realistic and satisfying result when we leave Glasgow at the end of this week?
You're full of hard questions this afternoon. So I think that there are steps, as I mentioned, to show trust. We can't leave here maintaining any sense of trust in this process if we do not see clearly how we are going to make the 100 billion real and how we're going to address the issue of doubling, not the quantum of adaptation so far, but the proportion of adaptation so far. So that's the first step. But we know the scale issues. Everyone has been talking about them. All the panelists this afternoon talked about the fact that at the country level, they're no longer looking at projects. They're looking at programs like Roofs to Reefs. And so for me, a real conversation about what is that instrument that allows us to leverage private investment at low interest rates, to be able to fit the urgency. Because here's the thing. Many of these issues that are on the table now are going to take time to settle. And I will say something that's probably a bit unpopular. I think that we have relied on the fact that these things take time. And I think that a result from Glasgow will be that we leave with a clear understanding of how we go from this week into next week, how we go from 2021 into January 2022, working on a short-term solution to the scale of finance that has to be met. You know, when I hear the notion that these numbers are too big, it makes me smile, because we've seen much larger numbers, as I mentioned, for the quantitative easing, that for the buying of instruments that countries have done, including to recover from the pandemic. And we are talking about a problem that we identified as urgent 6 years ago and before that. So I don't think it is that difficult as we sometimes like to make out. I think that we have to realize that time is up, and that we have examples of how these kinds of instruments work, and at the very least, that we have to have the boldness to test them and to see what can deliver results.
Thank you so much, Minister, for those inspirational remarks, and that concludes our session here. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I really didn't want that to stop. Thank you both for those insights. I know we are very late, but I will now ask or re-invite back to the stage Minister Yasmin Fuad, who will be opening up the plenary for those of you that would like to make statements. So for those of, I think, parties that are keen to make statements, please also be prepared if you need translation. I think you will need to get your translation at the back. And so Minister Yasmin will open and be joined also by His Excellency Minister Per Bolund, the Environment and Climate Minister of Sweden, who will be co-chairing this plenary session.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome to that part of our plenary discussion today. at the high-level ministerial dialogue on climate finance under the CMA. Your Excellencies, I would like to invite you to take the floor to make interventions of 3 minutes. And when we finish with the ministers and the delegations, we would go into the observer organizations. Parties and observers are also invited to submit a written statement which will be published to the UNFCCC website. There would be 3 questions that we will discuss during that panel today. Reflecting on the first round of the biennial 9.5 communication workshops and the 100 billion to enhance the predictability of financial support for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, how can we ensure that there will be more adaptation finance that is mobilized and that it is more readily accessible to those who need it the most? And thirdly, to deliver on the Paris, we need climate finance to flow from all sources and for all finance to be consistent with the low emission, resilient development. How can we ensure this delivers on the needs and the priorities of the developing country? I very much look forward to a lively discussion. With this, I would like to invite either heads of states of government to speak up. The floor is yours. European Union.
Thank you, dear ministers, distinguished delegates. The EU and its 27 member states welcome the exchange of information on the lesson learned in moving forward. As to the 100 billion goal, we would like to stress that the European Union and its member states are major contributors to climate finance. Furthermore, EU's multi-annual financial framework provides for the 7-year predictability time framework of the financial support. On biannual Article 9.5 communications, the EU member states cooperated on a comprehensive common submission. Evidence shows that the share of EU climate finance planned for adaptation purposes has been increased, with particular focus on the most vulnerable countries. In order to improve the predictability of financial support, it would be beneficial to align the delivery of the 9.5 submission with the timing of the national budgetary cycles. As a part of the EU, we are committed to support more adaptation actions. We believe it is important to integrate adaptation in broader development planning processes. Mobilizing private finance is essential to guarantee to respond to adaptation needs. Public climate finance should add to such funding. We recognize the need of increased mobilization of climate finance. It is of utmost importance to align all finance flows with the climate goals as a commitment by all parties, working in partnership with the recipient countries to prioritize climate action in their national economic and development strategies is a key to make climate finance an effective process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, EU. France.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to participate in this first high-level ministerial dialogue on climate funding under the auspices of the CMA, and this dialogue opens a space to underscore the importance of finance in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. The European Union and its member states, which include France, have extended their first 9.5 communications last year, and other developed countries did the same, and I would encourage other parties that provide climate financing to also communicate information on this. Since then, France has adopted a new climate funding commitment. We're mobilizing €6 billion per year between 2021 and 2025. of which 1/3 will go to climate adaptation funding. This is a significant increase compared to our previous commitment that was made at the COP21 in Paris and that we have already reached. The French Development Agency is also committed to ensuring that 30% of this climate funding has biodiversity co-benefits by 2025, and holistic environmental actions are our priority. Today I also announced that France will make a contribution of 20 million euros to the fund for the LDCs, which will include protecting the poorest and most vulnerable populations from climate change. France is fully committed to playing its full role in the collective objective of $100 billion from 2021 to 2025. And in that regard, there's the finance plan developed under the auspices of Ministers Wilkinson and Johan Svanberg. And I can state that in 2020, we will not achieve the goal, but I'm delighted that developed countries are explaining how and when they'll be reaching this by 2023 with clear information on the effectiveness of the funding, and this information will enable countries to fully implement their climate funding, and this is to do with predictability and climate transparency on mobilizing climate funding. And the panels pointed to several ways of engaging climate funding and extending communications in line with 9.5. And the dialogue has also shown that climate funding should help to align and channel all public and private funding to low-carbon development. And this is a crucial effort to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement and includes financiers as well as beneficiaries. And we must place the climate at the very top of our national economic priorities to ensure that investments and financing contribute to these priorities. We must also ensure that we mobilize the private sector more effectively for the climate in a complementary manner to public financing. Above and beyond the $100 billion, we need to transform finance in the way that we require it. Thank you very much.
And now I would like to invite Ms. Patricia Spinoza, Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, to the floor. The floor is yours, Patricia. Please.
Thank you very much. Dear ministers, dear friends, I'm really very pleased to have this opportunity to say a few words at this very important ministerial dialogue. I am sure that there will be a very long list of speakers, and we are all really very much interested in hearing from you on this very crucial topic. So I will keep my remarks very brief. Throughout these days of deliberations, we have been hearing that predictability and clarity in the provision and mobilization of climate finance remains absolutely crucial for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. We are also hearing that it's important with respect to enhancing ambition, especially with respect to overall public finance and specifically adaptation finance. I have to say I have been encouraged to hear that all countries have expressed their willingness to increase ambition, but developing countries have been very clear in saying that without the adequate support, they will not be able to do as much. And that is reflected also in the NDCs that they have presented. The conditional components of the NDCs that are conditional on receiving support is considerable. So I really think that this is an issue that requires a lot of support. The climate urgency requires specific actions on how public climate finance will be significantly scaled up and how private investment will be mobilized so that we get from the millions to the trillions. We must also build on lessons learned in order to find ways to overcome these challenges. And there is an absolute need to work collaboratively to build on progress achieved so far. The delivery plan on the 100 billion goal prepared by the developed countries is an important first step. And I again want to reiterate my appreciation to the Secretary of State of Germany, Jochen Flassbart, and the Minister Wilkinson from Canada for their very, very, very hard work. I also thank all those donor countries who have indicated their willingness to increase their commitment. So thank you very, very much. But following up on that first step, it is very important to follow through with more detail and concrete actions. As has been reiterated, there is also urgent need to significantly increase adaptation finance, especially through public finance. These efforts must be enhanced and they must go in hand with a just and fair transition. Developing country needs and priorities are crucial in this regard. So going forward, we are hearing encouraging new initiatives designed to scale up the mobilization of climate finance. This includes also initiatives to mobilize private climate finance as well. In light of the transformational shift we require, it will be important to significantly step up these efforts, both with respect to the predictability and clarity on public and private finance and access and delivery of climate finance. In this context, I do hope that you will address these points in your deliberations today. I want to thank you for your attention to this crucial issue and for your commitment. The bottom line is this: without the necessary financial support, we will not be able to embark on the transformation needed to achieve the 1.5-degree goal. Dear ministers, you have the power to facilitate this work. I respectfully call on you to make the bold and courageous decisions necessary to achieve it. I thank you for your work today and encourage you to continue working towards a successful outcome here at COP26. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would pass the floor to His Excellency Per Bolund, Minister for Environment and Climate and Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden. Thank you.